Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Yes, it is the second week of July, but it's not too late to plant tomatoes, especially early maturing varieties in large containers. America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, has the midsummer tomato planting tips. And mid-July is not too early to think about getting ready for your fall garden. Maybe you want to try something different this year, something that could spend the winter in the ground and actually end up sweeter and better tasting. We're talking about an old American and European fall-planted root crop. It's regaining popularity. It's the parsnip. Everyone wants things faster. Faster internet, faster drive-thru restaurants, faster maturing plants. Yeah, right. You can't rush Mother Nature. Give that plant at least 3 years to get growing. Where have I heard that before? We explain the time-honored garden saying of sleep, creep, leap. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots, and we'll do it all in under 30 minutes. Let's go. We like to answer your garden questions here on the Garden Basics podcast. Debbie Flower is here, our favorite retired college horticultural professor. And we get a question from Laura, who writes in and says, I picked out my 3 tomato plants for my pots. I'm doing it a little bit late, though, in the season. The person at the nursery chose the ones that looked good. They even had some tomatoes on them. He told me to put dry leaves or bark around the plants and also put eggshells and coffee mixed in the dirt. I have a couple of questions about that. Any other advice you can give me so I might be able to get a nice supply of delicious tomatoes this year? Thank you for your patience on that. Well, I like the idea of putting mulch around newly planted plants in the summertime. And by the way, it is summertime, especially for short season tomatoes. It's not too late.
Right.
For a lot of tomatoes.
Here in California, it's not too late.
I would think, I would stretch and say even in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you could plant a cherry tomato in July and still get tomatoes before you're ice skating.
In July, okay. My son lives in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and so I watch the weather there. And they're having some perfect tomato growing weather. Nights are warm enough. But do they have the 75 to 90 days, 3 months?
I think, like I say, if it's a cherry tomato variety that matures in 55 or 60 days.
Good point.
You got it.
Yep.
That's not an issue. So, yeah, don't give up on gardening. Just choose your varieties carefully.
Yes. Pay attention to that. The tags or the names. If it's not on the tag, you can Google the name and it will tell you how many days. And that's the days between typically when you plant it and you'll get a ripe tomato.
All right. Now, Laura in her letter also talked about washing the eggshells. Is it okay when I'm just breaking them, but when I do hard-boiled eggs, I can't wash the small cracked pieces well? I normally wash the membrane out that sticks to the inside of the shell. Do I have to do this? No, you don't have to do anything, Laura.
That's true. Well, the reason people worry about eggs and washing out the eggshell, though this would not apply for hard-boiled eggs, is that they can carry a disease called salmonella. So sometimes you're told not to eat a certain kind of salad dressing because it has raw egg in it. And that's what people are worried about. But eggshells are recommended because they contain calcium and plants need calcium and tomatoes need calcium. And sometimes tomatoes get a disease. It's an abiotic, meaning it's not caused by a living organism. It's caused by an environmental condition. And it's called blossom end rot. And it's technically due to lack of calcium. And so there's been some stories that you should add eggshells, which contain calcium, to the soil around tomatoes so they can get that calcium and they won't get blossom end rot. Number one is blossom end rot is really due more to irregular watering. In order to get calcium, calcium has to be carried to the roots of the plant in water. And if the soil dries out or the plant droops severely and is no longer working on pulling up water, the calcium doesn't get to the plant, and so that causes a lack of calcium in the plant. Another way you can get lack of calcium is to have an improper soil acidity, or you can knock it off by adding too many fertilizers, that, especially ones containing magnesium, that can throw off the ability of the plant to get calcium.
Sandy soil, too, can lead to blossom end rot because of going back to irregular watering, because the water drains so fast.
Right. And in containers, they dry out very quickly, so you can often end up having too dry of a soil. So there's typically enough calcium in the soil. It's just not getting to the plant. Number 2, in order to use eggshells as a source of calcium for plants, they need to be ground into a powder. If you've ever put them in the soil and happen to go back even years later and dig that soil, they're still there. If you even put them in your compost pile and you turn your compost pile, you regularly will see pieces of eggshell in it. It takes literally years for them to break down. So if you're willing to keep your eggshells and then grind them, people say if you dry them first a little bit in the oven, they crunch up finer, faster. I have not done it. I can't attest to that. But if you grind them into, and you have to have some sort of a pepper grinder or something, into a very fine powder, then you can use them as a source of calcium. But does your soil need calcium? Typically, it does not.
What about coffee grounds? What does that do for a plant?
They've done an analysis of coffee grounds, and they do have some nutritional value, meaning the 3 numbers on a fertilizer bag, the N, P, and K. But all tests on coffee grounds indicate that they have no effect. People think coffee grounds will change the pH, acidify the soil, make it more acid. And that can be helpful if your soil is, but only if your soil is too alkaline. However, all controlled experiments about that have not proven that coffee grounds can lower soil pH.
All right, so we can cross off coffee grounds, and frankly, using eggshells, if you've got enough calcium in the soil, it's just a matter of really the correct watering and the right pH to release that calcium that's already in the soil to be absorbed by the plant.
Right.
And then you will see on many sites recommendations for like sticking Tums in the ground. It's, the stomach upset.
Right. That as a source of calcium. Right. And then the other thing that is commonly recommended under tomatoes is Epsom salts. Yeah. And Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate. Calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are all needed by plants, but it's needed in very, 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 very tiny amounts. They're called micronutrients because they're needed in micro amounts, tiny amounts. If you use Epsom salts, that can throw off the calcium, and then you can end up with blossom end rot.
And if you use calcium, that can throw off the magnesium.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's best not to add anything unless you see a deficiency. And the number one deficiency in plant growth is nitrogen. Nitrogen is seen as dying old leaves, so they'll be at the bottom of the plant. They'll turn yellow, they'll fall off, accompanied by, and this is important that it's accompanied by, small new leaves. Now, all new leaves are small, but give them a few days and see if they stretch out to be a mature-sized leaf. If they do, and you're losing leaves at the bottom, then the leaves at the bottom are just probably in too much shade, and it's time for them to fall off because they've stopped doing anything for the plant. Plants shed parts when they are useless for them. But that's the number one deficiency in plants.
And all these homegrown recipes with Tums or coffee grounds or eggshells really aren't necessary.
Correct.
Mulch is good.
Mulch is great.
Regular watering is good as long as wherever the plant is. And if the plants are in containers, they're going to need more water more often.
Right. And depending on where you live, if you're in a very dry climate, they'll need water very frequently, maybe twice a day. If you're in a very moist climate, avoid those self-watering tomato planters because they'll drown.
And what about fertilizers? Now, I think we've discussed this a lot on the program, and I think we're both in agreement that people tend to over-fertilize.
Yes.
But I think with containerized plants, you have to be a little bit more judicious. about fertilization because that fertilizer, the nutrients that are in the soil can get washed out so easily.
Yes, they can. But it's easy in a container to go from too little to too much very quickly. Mm-hmm. So the rule of thumb I go by in containers is I do put some fertilizer, usually time release, when I pot the plant into the container. The bag that the time release fertilizer comes in, and it's kind of pricey, but it means I don't have to tend the plants quite so closely. But the bag gives directions, how much for the size of container I'm using.
And it's not much.
And you got to measure it.
Yeah.
And I always put in less than they say, because you can always add fertilizer, but once it's in there, you cannot take it out.
I believe it was Debbie Flower who once said, fertilize weekly.
Yes. That's another technique. There are people who love their water-soluble, it's usually blue stuff. Again, I used to do that even to my outdoor garden, but I would use 1/4 of the strength that the label says I should use, and it'll tell you an amount per gallon, and I apply it with every watering. Not quite every watering, periodically having a clean water, one with no fertilizer in it, just to help wash out any excess salts.
I like fish emulsion just because it's a weak fertilizer to begin with. The NPK content, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium content, 511 or 522. And I love the smell of fish emulsion in the morning.
Well, I've gone for the chicken manure route. Okay. I found a fertilizer of pelleted chicken manure. Its analysis is 431, and I've been using that this season on recommendation from the local master gardeners, and so far I've had great success. Yeah,
pelletized chicken manure is actually it's because it's aged. There's no danger of burning the plant,
right?
And it is pricey.
It is pricey. Yeah. It does have a bit of an aroma. The aroma can sort of, if you use chicken manure, whether I've used it before when it's not pelletized, the aroma can tell you how well aged it is or not.
So yes, you can plant when it's warm out, Laura, and as long as you mulch it and water it and
use big containers.
Use big containers, yeah.
Use big containers, yeah. Shade those containers so that they don't burn the roots. Water is going to be your number one issue in a container.
So it's always a good idea that if you're planting your garden and you're going to have containerized plants, make sure there's a hose bib nearby to remind you to give your plants a drink of water.
And it's easy. It's not a chore.
Right, exactly. So, Laura, good luck with your summer garden. Debbie Flower, thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure, Fred.
I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, Smart Pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with Smart Pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with Smart Pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. Do you like vegetables? Do you like unusual vegetables? Do you like pretty vegetables? Of course you do. There's a book out on the subject called Mastering the Art of Vegetable Gardening. It's a book by Massachusetts gardener Matt Mattis. He's an American visual designer, an artist, horticulturist, and futurist, a third-generation gardener of his family's property in Massachusetts. He runs the very popular gardening blog, Growing with Plants, that you can find at his website, growingwithplants.com. And he has a wonderful saying, treat your vegetable garden as your own private fantasy supermarket. And Matt, in your book, you come back to a very important point that what you grow in your home garden is going to taste better than what you find in the supermarket.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm kind of a foodie, so why we keep vegetable gardens today is different than, let's say, why our parents or grandparents or great parents may have had a vegetable garden. Then it was a victory garden, or we need to save money. And I think today it's more like, let's grow something that tastes better, ultimately tastes better, but it's a better quality. And for me, it's often something I can't find at the local supermarket.
In the last year, I've discovered the joys of such things as pak choy and joy choy and Malabar spinach as unusual edibles that are common in some cultures, just not common to us. What are some of the, I won't say unknown, but some of the vegetables that are unfamiliar to most Americans that you would like to see them try?
In seed catalogs now, there are new vegetables showing up all the time, and they're not really new. They're just, being reintroduced, if you will. Many of the Asian greens, and here in New England, of course, it's, we have to grow them as a fall crop, and they're done by Christmas. But any of the Asian brassicas, so anything in the cabbage family that's grown for its greens, so the bok choys and the tatsoys and anything in the mustard or cabbage realm grows best here. And I would assume for you as a fall, winter, even early spring crop, right?
Until it gets too hot, they do fine.
That's right. There are fewer insect problems in the cool weather.
Let's talk a little bit about some root crops that are popular to grow in our area, and they're probably popular with you because you've written about them in your book, Mastering the Art of Vegetable Gardening. And one of my newly found favorites is probably something that I didn't like as a child but have grown fond of it now, especially this time of year, and that's parsnips.
Yeah, parsnips and here in New England, it has a long history for parsnips. These go back to the Pilgrims. So if you're growing root vegetables, we all know carrots, we all know beets, but parsnips they're interesting because I would assume most of us have tasted parsnips now, but I think few people have grown them. And if you have grown them, they seem to be prone with some problems. They look fine, the plant looks fine, but then you attempt to pull the root out and you end up with something that looks like a baseball and not, a foot and a half long parsnip. And we're trained, I think, to be familiar with parsnips by what we find in the supermarket, which, crops that are designed to fit in a poly bag. So that they're a foot long and they're trimmed on the edges. But what I think a lot of people maybe don't know, and I encourage you to look on YouTube for exhibition parsnip growing, is that in the UK, in England, competitive parsnip growing is a sport. And they can grow parsnips, 3-4 feet long. So I took some of those tips that these crazy guys are using, which they might be growing them in pure sand or in potting mix in a hole drilled into a barrel, an oil barrel, and they grow them from seedlings. I tried to use that method in the home garden, which makes a lot of sense for root vegetables, especially here in New England where we have rocky soil. So I lay it out in the book, but in a few steps, you're drilling a hole and you're filling the hole with a very soft soilless mix like a Pro Mix or any soilless potting mix, and then laying in the seed carefully on the surface. Or I even try what the British do is lay in a seedling, which seems crazy for a root vegetable. But if it's grown perfectly well and you ensure that the seed root, that taproot, is perfectly straight when you set it in and lay the soil around it, you can, and I have, ended up with, 3-foot long parsnips, if you so need one that long.
And you mentioned in your book that sometimes you'll start them in long, narrow pots that out here we call tree pots, but I think back there they're called root trainers, and they're basically just long, narrow pots that allow for a root crop to get some length to it before you transplant it.
Yeah, it has to be done very carefully, like I said, but you will find on the internet and in some gardening blogs that people pre-germinate their seed on paper towels, or people go to great lengths with parsnips. As long as you're very careful and you ensure that root is perfectly straight when it's set into the soil, you're better off. You certainly don't want to, let's say, plant seeds and then transplant a seedling from the garden. But it can be done if you grow it carefully in a good soilless mix. I would imagine you can do it also by setting the seed on the ideal method of setting a seed on the soil in the garden and covering it lightly. The problem with that is parsnips can take, weeks to germinate.
Let's talk about harvesting parsnips. I would think you would have to be very careful digging the root out.
Yeah, you do. In fact, if you've done it properly, the root tip is, it's a thick root, but it'll turn into almost a hair-like root. So I think the British, on their rules for measuring, they want to extract the entire root. But I go down about 2 and 3 feet with a root shovel and then carefully dig around the root as if you're digging a tree. And you can feel by tugging on it and a parsnip is not as brittle as a carrot. It's a little more woody, so it will extract carefully.
Is a root shovel the same thing as a trench shovel?
Yes.
And then what do you do with a parsnip? I know we like to eat it raw in a salad.
Oh, really? I've never had it raw. No, it's something a New England farmer would have kept in a root cellar through the winter. Our house is 150 years old, so we have a root cellar, a cork-lined root cellar. It's built into our cellar. So I'm fortunate there that I can lay them in beds of sand where it's dark and it's about 35 degrees. But in a refrigerated drawer, washed off and trimmed, it should last a few months.
Wow. You just need a deep drawer to hold it.
Yeah, right.
What are some of the good parsnip varieties to try?
Well, Gladiator is classic. I always laugh at the names of the varieties because they always sound like something that's very large or massive. And certainly people wanted a large parsnip back in the 19th century. But most of them are British varieties. Half-long Guernsey, which is an heirloom variety. White Spear is a good one. But the Gladiator is a F1 hybrid and Javelin is an F1 hybrid. And both of those you should find in good seed catalogs like Johnny Select Seeds or even some of the larger names like a Burpee catalog.
You mentioned some of the heirloom and open pollinated varieties in your book like Half-long Guernsey and White Spear. Do they have problems that the hybrids don't have?
No, there may be a problem with some of the crowns being hollow, but most of them are because it's a root vegetable, there are less problems with root damage. Like anything in Apiaceae, so that would be all of your umbellifers, what we used to call them, right? Your dill, your parsley, and even parsnip. The problem would be with caterpillars. It would be with, butterfly and moth larvae.
What's nice about growing parsnips here is you can plant them from seed 3 times a year here in the valley. You can plant them in April, and then in July, and then again in October. Yeah, I'm a bit envious there. Here you can plant them in the Northeast, let's say Zone 5. They're sown in late March and April, or seedlings set into the ground later. But certainly the ideal way is seed sown direct. But it's a long season crop. We can keep them through the winter, and often they get sweeter with the ground freezing, and they can handle ground freezing. But we'll throw straw on them so we can dig them up under a snow cover. The name of the book is Mastering the Art of Vegetable Gardening. It's by Matt Mattis, and Matt profiles many of your favorite vegetables in the book, such as onions, garlic, asparagus, rhubarb, artichokes, cabbage, cauliflower, beets, Swiss chard, the lettuces, carrots, beans, okra, and, of course, the standards, tomatoes and peppers, as well as cucumbers and squash. It's really a beautiful book, well written, and like I say, his philosophy is outstanding. Treat your vegetable garden as your own private fantasy supermarket. And check out his blog as well. growingwithplants.com is where you will find it, growingwithplants.com, and the name of the blog is Growing with Plants. Matt Mattis, thanks for a few minutes of your time today. Thank you, Fred. On Friday's Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast, we get your nose twitching. It's garden shows for the nose, plants with enticing aromas. It might be the flowers, it could be the leaves. There's plenty to choose from. Plus, we explain why familiar scents immediately transport us back in time to recall hopefully fond memories from years ago. It's the way the nose is wired to the brain, and the nose takes a different pathway than the other senses. It's in the next Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. It's out Friday, July 15th. Find a link to it in today's show notes or visit our website, gardenbasics.net. That's where you can sign up to have the free Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter delivered to your inbox each Friday. Also at gardenbasics.net, you can listen to any of our previous editions of the podcast, as well as read a transcript of the podcast episode you're listening to now. That's at gardenbasics.net. For current subscribers, look for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter on Friday, July 15th in your email. Take a deeper dive into gardening with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, and it's free. Find the link at gardenbasics.net. We got a quick tip for you. Debbie Flower is here, our favorite college horticultural professor, and she must be hanging out at nurseries too, because when I visit nurseries, it's not uncommon to hear the three words sleep, creep, and leap. And it's usually in reference to plants. What's that all about, Debbie Flower?
Yeah, that's about those plants that you're putting from a container or a ball and burlap into the landscape or even bare root. And what they do in the years that follow. The first year when you put them in the ground, they just sleep. They're just getting adjusted. They're getting their roots to grow and expand and run into places where there's good water and nutrition. And most of the growth that's happening that first year is underground. And the second year, they start to show more above ground growth. It's not a lot, so they creep. The growth above ground is creeping. And the third year, typically, they're much better established, they got a great root system, and they just take off, so they leap. So this is applied to perennials, things that live 3 or more years in the landscape. And it varies in how much the sleep, how deep the sleep is, I guess I'd say, and how slow the creep is and how big the leap is. That varies by species, but it's a very good rule of thumb. And it really says to me, I have to be patient. I just put it in the ground. The first year, it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot. I just have to be patient.
I would think this would hold true for shrubs and trees as well.
Absolutely. Shrubs and trees are technically perennials because they live more than 3 years. And that's I had a student take me to task on that. So I'm a little sensitive about that. Woody plants, shrubs and trees being woody plants, do live more than 3 years or have a lifespan more than 3 years. Hopefully for you, they will live more than 3 years. But they are, if you're looking at a book or you're going to the garden center, they're going to be in a separate place than the perennials. The perennials are typically the herbaceous perennials. Some of those herbaceous perennials may die to the ground and disappear all winter long and then reappear in the spring. Others will have a presence above ground, but it tends to be a smaller plant, and then it springs to life and does its flowering the next year. So those things are called perennials. If they form wood, they're typically in the tree or shrub section.
There you go. Sleep, creep, and leap. And if you have any doubts, before you yank a plant out, if it's growing too slow for you, put a stake in the ground next to it at exactly the height it is, and then walk away for a few months and come back the following spring. I bet that plant will be taller than the stake.
Good point. The other is take pictures. Everybody's got a smartphone, right?
Yep. Or take your old smartphone and stick that in the ground, and when it gets taller than the smartphone, you know it's growing.
Oh, well, that drawer I have full of old phones, I could do that with.
There you go. All right. Well, we have slept, we have crept, we have leapt. Debbie Flower, thanks again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Fred.
Garden Basics with Farmer Fred comes out every Tuesday and Friday, and it's brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Garden Basics, it's available wherever podcasts are handed out. For more information about the podcast, visit our website, gardenbasics.net, and that's where you can find out about the free Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Basics. And thank you so much for listening.